Alejandro Reimers. I'm a professor of international education here at the school where I direct the program in international education policy. With me on the panel today are my colleagues, Professors David Bloom and Matthew Jukes, whom I'm going to introduce in a second, as well as Pamela Hogan, the producer of Wide Angle. David Bloom, to my left, is the Clarence James Gamble Professor of Economics and Demography in the Department of Population and International Health, and he's been the co-director of a major research project on universal basic education, and his presentation today, I think, is going to draw on that work. Matthew Jukes is an assistant professor of international education at our school. His research with PCD has helped establish the educational benefits of treating worm infections, iron deficiency, and malaria in preschool and school children, with projects based in India, Kenya, Tanzania, and the Gambia. His research also addresses the relationship between HIV/AIDS and education, working to improve HIV prevention programs in Kenya and educational access of orphans in Zimbabwe. He's also interested in improving access and quality in primary education more generally. Pamela Hogan, who's going to respond to our initial commentary, is a series producer for Wide Angle, PBS Primetime International Current Affairs series. With the series since it was launched in 2002, she has spearheaded films such as Time for School, this longitudinal documentary of which you have seen one program. She has produced for Bill Moyers, PBS, the commercial networks, and cable television. With Harvard professor Peter Gallison, she produced Ultimate Weapon, the H-Bomb Dilemma, about the secret moral debate surrounding the construction of the first H-bomb in the 1940s. She also led the expansion of Reader's Digest, TV and video into new markets, executive producing and supervising dozens of other productions. But most importantly, she's really very interested in your suggestions for how these series can be used in American schools to foster global education. And I think she's going to talk a little bit about that later. I would like to highlight a few aspects of this really exquisite documentary. First, the film shows in fine detail that schools matter. The opportunity to go to school matters to children in the present and matters to the expectations of children and to their parents about their future. The film suggests that the schools may matter more, both in the present and in terms of expanding future freedoms, in contexts where life is tough. Whether it is in Afghanistan, where the school provides Shukfa a time to develop her mind and to be with friends, when much of her day is consumed by hard physical labor, or whether it is in Kenya, where teachers and classmates help Job pull through after his mother's death, or whether it is in Brazil, where Jefferson, incipient learning of science and literacy, keeps him safe from the gang violence in the streets of the slum where he lives. The documentary shows in the contrasting images of these children in school and out of school, and in the voices of the children, that schools are good places to be in. The opportunity to be in a school is important to all children, but it's noticeably more important for those who cannot learn what they learn in school at home. The documentary also speaks to the aspirations of children and their parents about the ways in which going to school will expand their freedoms, their opportunities to work, to do things that the parents cannot do. The film makes clear that to a great extent, the educational enterprise is defined by its social purposes, by the way in which schools are expected to prepare students for the future and in this way shape society. And David is going to talk more about these purposes, about the reasons to educate children. The film also shows in beautiful detail how the many layers that conform educational opportunity interact in a complex system. At the core of this system is the nature of the interactions between these seven children and their teachers. These interactions are supported by different conditions in classrooms. We see how different these interactions are in the well-supplied classroom attended by Jefferson in Brazil, with textbooks and libraries in the background, or in the classroom that Ken attends in Japan, versus the classroom in Benin, where Nanani and her classmates learn to write on small tablets with barren walls and with no visible instructional materials. The 7 stories showcased in the documentary exemplify very well how education policy matters to the opportunities that children have. in Afghanistan, Shukfa is able to attend school because national policy and international support have now opened schools for girls. Joab goes to school in Kenya because the government decided to eliminate school fees to attend primary education in 2003, fees that Joab's father was unable to afford. Raluca goes to a school that is focusing on teaching her to think for herself because education leaders in that country decided that political changes call for changes in the types of skills and abilities that students needed to develop. The curriculum of her school focused on French, mathematics, and humanities, and explicitly focused on developing her capacity to think critically. Niraj can attend school in India because government policy supports night shift schools that make it possible for children like her who work during the day to receive some education. The odds of children like Jefferson in Brazil to be in school are much greater today because deliberate policies implemented during the last 10 years focus on closing the gap in access among different income groups, using programs that provided low-income families financial support to keep their children in school. We see how, even though both of his parents are out of work, Jefferson attends school because the financial support his family receives is conditional on Jefferson staying in school. Nanani attends school in Benin because a government-sponsored initiative, the Fee pour Fee program, targets girls and recruits them to school and provides support, mostly in the form of a big sister that helps her stay in school and do well academically. Ken's academic prowess has been shaped by a national curriculum that sets high expectations for all students and supports teachers to teach to those expectations, and by a national policy to attend quality preschool since age 1. This documentary makes very clear that to a great extent, these children are in school because national policies have created and support schools in ways that make it possible for them to learn. An inference from this line of reasoning is that if the opportunity to be in school reflects the success of policy and programs, the lack of opportunity is a sign of policy failure. So here are two takeaway lessons from this documentary. Schools matter to children in their present and to their future freedoms, and the choices governments make matter to the way in which schools matter. I would now like to talk about, briefly, fruitful avenues to help governments make choices that will increase the likelihood that schools do matter for children. Policies and programs that are based on accurate knowledge about the underlying mechanisms that relate individual choices of students and parents with the social dynamics of schools are more likely to create opportunities to learn than those that are based on faulty theories. The underlying program theory of the choices made by governments will be stronger where it is based on a scientific understanding of the way in which students learn and on the ways to support quality instruction. Building this understanding is the task of the science of education. Like with other sciences, our understandings of our object of study is always provisional. We know certain things to be true until we know better. As with other sciences, the validity of what we accept as true depends on intersubjective agreement about the approaches we follow to study the issues that fall within the domain of our science. As with other professions interested in generating knowledge that is consequential for practice, an aspect of the validity of our understandings rests in focusing on the study of topics that those involved in practice recognize as consequential and important. I suggest that educational research to improve educational opportunity in contexts such as those featured in the documentary should focus more on helping to define the domains of knowledge that students should learn and how best to create opportunities in schools so that students can develop those competencies. If the documentary shows that schools matter, it is clear that what most matters about them is what students learn. And what students learn is first a function of what teachers try to teach them of the curriculum, and of the curriculum in practice as defined by the pedagogies enacted by teachers. I realize that to suggest that defining a national curriculum is a priority in an institution in a country where there is no national curriculum is likely to meet with some resistance. In this film, in a film that provides a window into 7 different education systems through the educational trajectories of 7 children, I see principally that schools matter or not because they achieve their social purpose of expanding the freedoms of students and enable them to do things which they would not be able to do had they not had the opportunity to spend part of their lives in these kinds of institutions. Helping to define what those skills and capabilities are and creating the opportunities in the daily school experiences of these students is the central task of a science of education. I would like to conclude with a brief reference to the last few minutes of the documentary. As the producers went back 3 years later to visit the same children and showed them and their communities the images and sound of the first documentary, these opened in these children numerous questions about the other children in distant lands which were featured in the documentary. As the film concludes, we hear the children asking questions about what they have in common with these other children. We hear one of them ask, "Do you play soccer? Who do you talk to in the morning if you have no siblings?" And we also hear them beginning to reflect about the bonds that tie them to each other. We hear Ken say, "Take care when you come home at night, when you go to school at night." As I think about these children exploring their common humanity with others in 6 distant places in the globe, I ask what questions we ask ourselves and how often about children around the world who may not go to school or who may not learn as much as they should. And I ask whether our own educational system, for all its privilege, has failed us if we are unable to recognize the bonds that tie us to these children and to act on them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fernando, and good afternoon, everyone. I very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in this gathering. I also have a great deal of respect for your commitment to international education because it's really gorgeous outside, and you're here when you could be there, so thank you for that. As Fernando noted, I'm an economist. That makes me a member of a tribe that's often said to know too much for its own good and not enough for anyone else's. Even worse, it often involves taking the obvious and making it utterly incomprehensible. But this afternoon, I'm going to use my 20 minutes, to try to keep with the spirit of the film that was just screened, to break with long-standing economic tradition, and to take a few complex realities and to try to make them appear a bit more obvious, mainly in an effort to inform some subsequent discussion of the film itself. The realities I'd like to focus on relate to 2 challenges that are highlighted in the film. The first has to do with the global shortfalls in the realm of primary education. And the second has to do with the resources that are needed to address the challenges that we face, along with, as Fernando mentioned, the justifications that we have available to us for devoting public resources to educational development at both the national and the international levels. H.G. Wells once described human history as a race between education and catastrophe. I rather like the image of a race because I find it quite apt if one looks at the global primary school picture over the past few decades. And to begin, to paint that picture, I would start by just observing that many of the world's aspirations for education are reflected fairly clearly in a whole series of UN declarations, programs of actions, covenants, and conventions. And please keep in mind here that declarations are purely aspirational. They're non-binding statements that emerge from political processes as opposed to covenants and conventions or treaties which are binding under international law. And there are 4 documents that I'd like to draw our attention to. The first is, as you see the first bullet here, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was drafted between 1975 and 1990. It's the world's most nearly universally accepted human rights treaty. It's been signed by 195 countries and ratified by 193 countries. The only 2 countries that haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child are Somalia and, you guessed it, the United States. It may be the only thing the 2 countries have in common, but there you have it. Article 28 of this Convention on the Rights of the Child says that, or states that primary education should be compulsory and available free to all. The second statement of educational aspiration emerged in 1990 at the World Conference on Education for All, which was held in Jomtien, Thailand. At that conference, there were 155 delegates who completely declared their interest in universalizing primary education and in dramatically reducing illiteracy by the year 2000. The delegates left that meeting all charged up, and their countries actually made quite respectable educational advances in the 1990s. But by the year 2000, it was absolutely clear that the goal of universal primary education was nowhere close to being achieved. So the world did what the world often does. It granted itself what I like to think of as a no-cost extension by adopting a new framework for action in the year 2000 at the Dakar World Education Forum. And at that forum, there were representatives from 164 countries who basically declared their commitment to universal primary education also, but this time by the year 2015. And finally, we also have, in the year 2000, the international community essentially reinvigorated its collective educational goal by including the universal completion of primary education by the year 2015 among the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations. And I would also note here that the Millennium Development Goals also call for the elimination of gender disparity in primary and secondary education, and as it's worded, preferably by the year 2005 and at all levels by the year 2015. And all 191 members of the United Nations have pledged to meet those goals. Well, now it's not working. There we go. Okay, now we're in 2007, and the fact of the matter is, the plain fact is that 1/6 of the world's children of primary school age are not enrolled in school. We could spend a lot of time going over the facts and figures, and what we'd see is that there are big differences across regions. These differences mirror the very graphic images that you saw in the film, ranging from the situation in Japan and Romania at one extreme to that in Brazil and Benin at the other. It's also quite apparent at this point in time that the 2015 deadline for universal primary education will not be met. Even if countries continue to enjoy the same rate of increase in educational access that they've experienced since Jomtien, there will be 114 million primary age kids out of school in the year 2015, 114 million being higher than the current 97 million. The way I think of this problem is being closely akin to when we were kids and we tried to run up an escalator that was going down. It's very difficult to do. The analogy here is that educational access is not even expanding fast enough to keep pace with rates of population growth in the world, at the same time that those rates of population growth are actually slowing. It's a little outside the pale of the film and perhaps this discussion, but I wanted to mention as well that primary education is only the tip of the iceberg. The story of global educational progress deteriorates further as we shift the focus of our attention to secondary education, and even further when we begin to train our eyes on the matter of educational quality. Rising numbers of primary school graduates, coupled with rising income, have led to increased demand for secondary education. That increased demand is being addressed in all regions of the world, as you see from the bar charts here. I guess the deep purple ones being all higher than the light purple ones. But the fact is that with the exception of the developed countries of the world, and some countries in the former Soviet Union, basically Eastern Europe and Central Asia, there are sizable shortfalls apparent here with respect to that 100% line. That's basically essentially the target. The estimate corresponding to the 97 million kids of primary school age who are not in school, when it comes to secondary school, increases. It's 226 million children of secondary school age that are not currently attending school. That translates into 30% of the relevant age group, 12 to 17-year-olds worldwide. These shortfalls, the shortfalls in secondary education, are, I think, significant because both historical and comparative analysis suggest that countries exhibit sluggishness in the countries that exhibit sluggishness in the expansion of secondary schooling tend to find it quite difficult to advance economically. Let's say, as measured by the growth rate of income per capita. Part of the problem these countries experience is because they have a thin and fragile skill base. Part is due to the broader social effects of educational expansion. So, for example, women who don't make it to secondary school tend to have more children than those who do make it to secondary school. They tend to give their children a childhood that is materially more spare than those who make it to secondary school, and they build a weaker foundation for future economic progress in the country. Another piece of the puzzle that's missing from our global educational aspirations, because none of those four documents I mentioned refer to secondary education, neither do any of those documents refer to educational quality. And that challenge arises because, as I think is very, very clear in the film, number one, enrollment doesn't mean attendance. Number two, attendance doesn't mean receiving an education. And number three, receiving an education doesn't mean receiving a good education. According to some calculations that were done as part of a project at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called UBASE, which stands for Universal Basic and Secondary Education, that Joel Cohen at the Rockefeller and Columbia University and I co-direct, based on standardized test scores, so think of TIMSS or Pearls, PISA, here 75 to 95% of the world's children live in countries where the quality of education lags behind, and usually far behind, the average of the wealthy industrial countries, basically the OECD countries. Now, I want to give you a few additional facts which have quite recently come to my attention. The next few facts relate to India. Okay, and I think many of us think of India as a real powerhouse in the realms of math and science. But the foundational reality for that perception seems to be a little shaky based on some of this evidence. So this comes from a recent study of students in 142 of India's top private schools. And the message is that the proportion, as you'll see, I think I certainly find it shocking, and I think you may as well, could not get beyond rote memorization. So here's one of the questions that was asked. It was asked to class 4 students, so let's say 8 to 10-year-olds. And the question really required measuring the length of a pencil. And the correct answer for the length of this pencil is, of course, 5 centimeters. Okay, but the 77%, more than 3/4 of the kids who answered this question, actually said it was 6 centimeters. They could read the 6 off the ruler, but they didn't realize you have to subtract 1 because it's starting. Okay, it really just shows, I think, an utter lack of understanding of simple measurement. Okay, another example at a higher grade. The question is, what's the chemical formula of pure steam? Well, among class 6 students, so a couple of years older, okay, only 1 in 6 of those students recognize that steam is nothing more than gaseous water. So they know that if you ask them what's the chemical formula for water, they all, I think on this test, got it right, that it's H2O. And they understand that water becomes steam, but they didn't make that connection between steam and H2O. And here's yet one more, just one more example. So this is an example where they asked students which of these numbers is almost equal to 423.1. And what you see is in class 4, over 60% of the students said 4,231. Okay, because clearly they're focusing on the same digits. It has all the same digits as 423.1, and nearly half the students in class 6. So a little over half the students between classes 4 and 6 gave really a horrendously way off answer to this question, because again they're focusing on the digits and they're ignoring the decimal point. Again, rote memorization only takes you so far. This is, I would say, And the way the authors of this study interpret it is as evidence of a lack of real understanding of the meaning of the lessons and tools. Now, these educational deficits that I've mentioned are, I would say, hugely consequential problems from a number of perspectives. And they're problems that all have an element of pathos to them, because the fact of the matter is they are absolutely surmountable. So, formidable, yes; insurmountable, no. So just as one example, it's been estimated that it would cost between $6.5 and $35 billion a year to get all kids in the world, those 97 million kids in the world, to get them all into primary school. Now, I'm an economist. I'd be the first to acknowledge that $6.5 to $35 billion is certainly a great deal of money, but I would also point out that it's well within our capacity to fund. And as one yardstick, I would just draw your attention to the fact that that amount, even the upper end, $35 million, is less than 1/3 of the yearly U.S. outlays for the destruction and reconstruction of Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's hard to imagine that this is something that we can't afford, given that just one country in the world is already spending much more money on that in such a horrendously frivolous way. Now, I also want to draw to your attention that there are a number of quite powerful arguments, powerful and I would say very well-established arguments in support of devoting national and also global public resources to educational development. And I just want to run through them. Fernando asked me if I do this, so let me just sketch them for you. The first set of arguments is what I call here moral, ethical, and humanitarian. So basically, devoting resources to education is the right thing to do, it's a good thing to do, it's the just thing to do, it's a fair thing to do, basically those kinds of arguments. The second argument is that education is a fundamental human right. The opportunity to be educated, therefore, is a legally just claim to which all human beings are entitled just by virtue of the fact that we're human beings. Both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 and the Convention on the Rights of the Child that I mentioned before embody that principle. As one example, the Universal Declaration proclaims free and compulsory education to be a basic human right. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration states that everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Third argument, which I think is really quite incontrovertible, is an economic argument. So essentially, education improves the productivity and the economic well-being of individuals, and it also promotes technological and institutional innovation and the economic performance of societies, including, I would highlight, the reduction of poverty. And I highlight the reduction of poverty because poverty reduction is the central imperative of the entire international development community as expressed in Millennium Development Goal number 1. And it's one of 8 goals, but it is absolutely by far recognized as the most important goal. Now, we have quite a bit of evidence from the fields of education economics, labor economics, development economics, that indicate that each year of additional schooling that an individual receives is associated with a boost in their rates of pay and their earnings. And it's a substantial boost. We're talking about each additional school year contributing between 10 and 20% to their incomes. And that's true not just at the level of individuals, it also aggregates up to the level of nations in the sense that education is very well established as a fundamental determinant of the wealth of nations, to steal a phrase from Adam Smith. It also appears to be true in predominantly agriculture-based economies. So, for example, and this is very important because we're speaking mostly today about primary education, but educated farmers, for example, are known to be better at accessing and implementing new technologies, whether that involves the use of new seed, new fertilizer, or irrigation systems. And the benefits of having educated farmers not only accrue to the educated farmers themselves, but they also spill over to other farmers in the community who notice how well they're doing and are basically able to imitate, to learn from and imitate their practices. A number of case studies also support these findings. There were two that I wanted to mention very briefly because they relate to countries that are covered in the film. As just one example, in Amartya Sen's book, Development is Freedom, he basically argues that the economic success of Japan in the past 150 plus years was driven by its focus on expanding education even before educational development was underway. And he goes on to argue also that, by way of contrast, that India's neglect of basic education has left it quite unprepared for economic expansion, although the Indian economy has gone essentially from being quite moribund for the last several decades to, I know if people have been reading the news, I guess the big concern at the moment is that the economy is growing so fast, it's starting to overheat. It's also recognized that there's an especially high rate of return for investments in girls' education. So there is a very interesting article that was published in 1992 in Scientific American. It's a one-page article. It was published by the then chief economist of the World Bank, our former fearless leader, Larry Summers, who basically argued that investments in the education of girls and women have higher returns than any other investment in physical or human capital, mainly because educated women confer such substantial tangible benefits on their families and their communities. As you see here, he entitled his article on the education of girls, "The Most Influential Investment." Now, in addition to the moral, human rights, and economic arguments in favor of education, we can also point to two sources of non-economic benefits that accrue from educational progress. And first, we have the social benefits of education, in that education is said to be essential to building cohesive, equitable, and durable societies. And second, we have the political benefits of education. Essentially, the idea here being that educational progress mitigates inequality within and also between nations and thereby promotes political stability and security. We also have the idea, of course, that the familiar idea that democracies function better when people have more access to information and the ability to process information and communicate better. So just maybe now to move to just some closing remarks. I'd just like to sort of say that I think that the picture here is not all one of doom and gloom. There's also a bit of promising news, and for me the promising news is the perception that I have that the world actually understands now, the world has come to understand that education, the global education scene, is not what it should be or could be. Thanks partly to the efforts of filmmakers, great filmmakers like Pam Hogan, many powerful people in the world now understand and are willing to back that understanding with their political and financial muscle, the view that we're not doing that well in, as I said earlier, H.G. Wells referred to as the race against catastrophe. Many of these leaders are starting to view the issue now as not whether to act, but rather what to do. It's now taken by many as a foregone conclusion. We need to do something. The question is what to do. So the focus is shifting increasingly to identifying and comparing the options that we have for making a difference in the lives of kids like Neeraj and Joab and Nanavi and Jefferson. And I find that personally very, very encouraging because, to my mind, that's where the field of international education needs to live for the next decade or two. So we address those problems. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Jukes. I teach here, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the research response to this problem, and also the role that health plays in getting children back to school. Research, because we are standing in a research institute. Well, I'm standing in a research institute, mainly sitting in one. But I'd like to start by thanking Pam for a fantastic film. I just thought it was really inspiring. For those of us who spend most of our time thinking about children as statistics in research papers or in policy documents, to see 7 lives come to life in such rich detail is really inspiring and wonderfully illuminating. I would like to return, however, to referring to children as statistics, to make a point that 600 million children are of school age in poor countries and developing countries. Almost another 600 million are of secondary school age. So these are vast numbers of children. Around 90% of all children who are of primary school age in the world live in poor countries. So these are not some kind of irrelevant backdrop. They're not some anthropological curiosity. They are the world's next generation. They are the people who, in 20 or 30 years' time, will be driving the world's economy, will be voting in the next world's governments, and will be managing the world's resources. And given the opportunity, they could provide the next generation of scholars thinking about the kinds of issues that we're talking about. Which would be a good thing, because if you looked at the current crop of research output that targets child development and education, you'd be forgiven for thinking that 90% of school-age children lived in the United States or in Europe, and that these children were the ones who are suffering the greatest problems. There's a huge global inequality in the origins and in the focus of scholarship across the world. But why is research important? Well, Fernando was talking about the importance of accurate knowledge to guide policy, and it really is, I'm convinced, an effective way to tackle the sort of problems that we're talking about. DFID, the UK Development Agency, conducted a study which found that every pound that they'd spent on research projects was more effective at reducing poverty than every pound that they'd spent on programs. And the argument still holds if you convert it into dollars. And whilst you may not be convinced by a researcher telling you about a research study demonstrating the effectiveness of research studies, I think that as we're all reflecting on this issue, you'll agree that providing primary education, even primary education alone, to 600 million children around the world is an enormously complex task. Children have to have the right instructional materials. They have to have a trained and motivated teacher led by a strong school management. They themselves have to be free of distractions of other tasks at home. They need to try and combat the barriers financial barriers to attending school, and also that they need to be see that their efforts will be rewarded in terms of jobs and in terms of secondary school places. So, if you look at it in those terms, it's perhaps not surprising that the greatest development successes of the last 50 or so years have been in the field of health, and particularly childhood vaccinations, where, by contrast with education, things have to be right just for the day of a vaccination problem, the day of a vaccination program. Although such programs are not without their problems, this seems to me more simple than getting all the conditions right for children to learn every day of every school term for 7 or 8 years. So, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about work I've done that has tried to bring the benefits of simple health interventions to the field of education. and in so doing, try and demonstrate that that research, when research does take place in the poorest countries in the world, it can have a significant impact on the way that donors and governments implement policies. This all depends on my understanding of this. Oh, there we go. Fantastic. The first problem that we come across is getting children into school. And we saw in examples in the film from Benin and from Afghanistan and from Rajasthan in India that the decisions that parents make about enrolling children in school are quite fragile. And particularly so for girls, they're finely balanced. This is a result of a study we undertook in the Gambia to look at the impact of protecting children from malaria, which is a major health problem in that country, how it impacted their chances of going to school. And what we found was that at the beginning of the 90s, when this study was taking place, girls were around 6 times less likely to enroll in school than boys. But as a result of the malaria program that they took part in, this graph shows that they were twice as likely to enroll in school as their peers who had not benefited from this program. Yeah. And once they're in school, of course, how well they do in school, how well they learn, and how long they stay in school is the next issue to deal with. This is some calculations we've done based on a study in South Africa that related children's achievement in the early years of their schooling to how long they stayed in school and how well they did at school. And the middle squiggly purple line shows you that this is children who achieved on average, whose achievement was about at the average level. About 40% of them made it to the end of primary school. If we come down just a little bit, and we look at children who performed about a quarter of a standard deviation below the mean, so this is like moving from the 50th percentile in the class to the 40th percentile, the expected attainment was less than 7 years. Children were expected to drop out before the end of primary school. However, we nudge it up just a little bit, again moving from the 50th percentile to the 60th percentile. 70% of these children reach the end of primary schooling. So this result, I think, is enormously important, particularly given the sort of learning outcomes that we're seeing across the world and that David presented. I have one to add. In Uttar Pradesh recently, they found that in 4th grade, 75% of children were unable to read a sentence. Something that the documentary showed us that children in Japan could do on the 2nd day of schooling. So if children are not performing well early on, what implications is this having for how well they do at school and how long they stay there? Now, the reason I model this on a quarter of a standard deviation is because when we assess children's cognitive abilities around the world as they are improved by health interventions, this is about the sort of improvement that we find. So these are 4 typical studies providing children with breakfast, giving them iron supplementation, or deworming them, improves their achievement and their cognitive abilities around about this kind of margin. And so the theory is that if we can get to them early enough, this should have a large cumulative impact on their enrollment and their achievement. This is a study we conducted not far from Rajasthan, in Delhi, and we found that children, even in preschools, are able to attend a lot better when they're given some kind of iron supplementation. So the theory is that this will help them to stay in school, and this is also what we find in practice. The results of our study from the Gambia, which followed children who'd taken part in a malaria program, we found for those that had been in the program for 4 years, you see that the light blue are the children who didn't receive malaria, and they, on average, went to school for about 3.5 years. And for those who had been protected from malaria, they went to school for over 5 years. So what we postulate in theory holds in practice, that improving children's health and improving their achievement early on can make a difference to the amount of time they spend in school. And these are not just isolated incidents. Returning to the issue of scale, if we look around the 600 million or so children of primary school age around the world, huge numbers of them are suffering from the kind of illnesses that affect their achievement and their attendance. About a third of them have worm infections, about half of them are stunted in growth, and about half of them are anemic. We estimate that the total effect across the world of these kind of illnesses, for instance, on the amount of time that children spend in school, is that there are between 200 and 500 million lost years of schooling among children who are currently in school. And better yet, the cost of these kind of interventions is very low. The estimate is that it costs about $3.50 to add an additional year of school attendance through a deworming program. And iron supplementation is at a similar level, and various other health interventions are a little more expensive, but a lot cheaper than many of the subsidization programs that are taking place to improve children's attendance. Yeah. I talked about the field of health overseeing some of the greatest successes in development. Well, of course, health also brings us the biggest development disaster, which is HIV/AIDS. We saw in the film how devastated Joe was when his mother died, possibly from HIV/AIDS, and how he dropped out of school for a while. This is some work we've done in Zimbabwe, which shows you the odds of children engaging in sexual behavior in their teenage years, according to whether or not their parents have died. And we find that children whose mothers have died are around twice as likely, both for boys and for girls, to be engaging in sex during their teenage years. What's so important for these children, and it's something that we've all touched on, and was illustrated in Brazil, how Jefferson saw his school as another home for him, somewhere where he felt connected. And all the research suggests that amongst children who are orphaned, those who stay on at school have better psychological outcomes and generally thrive. And of course, as we saw that Job was learning about HIV/AIDS at school, evidence tells us that, for instance, in Uganda, where the incidence of HIV declined dramatically after a government intervention, that those who had got primary or secondary schooling, the rates of HIV declined much more quickly. So the impact that this kind of research is having is that there's a vast expanse of school health programs around the world. In the last 7 years, we've seen a big leap in the number of agencies who have integrated programs and school health programs to address simple diseases and nutrition problems, and also to bring health education, have spread across Africa. And this is a coloured graph that shows you where training programs have taken place with ministries of education to think about their response to HIV/AIDS in the last few years. I think that the way that this research has informed policy is an example of how, if we produce quality research that people can act on, it can have a big impact on policy. But I think it's also a shameful reflection that such simple and in some ways such simplistic programs, which are catching people's attention to get kids into school, rather than the more complex and a demanding task of providing children with education throughout their lives. And it's my hope that We don't have to wait for this current crop of 600 million children to grow up to be the scholars who tackle these problems, and that we can strive towards making a difference in the global inequalities of educational research. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando, I want to thank you for focusing today's forum on back to school. I'm the first to say that each of the 7 children profiled in the film is a genius, but even I didn't think they were going to make it here by 3rd grade, so it's really an honor to be here. And also I want to thank David, who's been an amazing resource for the film, both on camera, if you saw his cameo at the open, but also behind the scenes, reading scripts, looking at the film in progress, helping us frame the issues, putting us in touch with global educators, really tirelessly helping because he's so committed to to these issues. And so we really thank you, David, for making sure that we don't get it completely wrong. The idea for this film came about in 2002 when I read an op-ed piece in the New York Times by Amartya Sen. It was called "To Build a Country, Build a Schoolhouse." And it brought out all the numbers we've been hearing today about how many hundreds of millions of children are out of school. And also the fact that there was a global campaign that had been taken on and promised by the developed countries of the world that by the year 2015, all children would get an education. Of course, only England so far has stepped up to the plate with their full commitment, but all the other developed countries did make that promise. And so our films are going to keep returning to these children who, as it happens, are slated to graduate from high school in 2015, the year of the MDG goal. And so it's a kind of holding government's feet to the flame, a kind of a checklist. Are these children's lives changing? Are things changing in their countries as the world progresses towards this goal, however falteringly? Wide Angle is a PBS documentary series devoted to global subjects. We're on we're the summer replacement for Frontline. We're on once a week in prime time on Tuesdays, and our whole focus is to look for global issues through human stories. So this kind of was a perfect fit with our focus. And Fernando wanted me to talk a little bit about impact. PBS shows. We reach a couple million people at a time, not huge by commercial network standards, but a lot of the impact really is after the broadcast. And this film and this project has been taken up by a number of advocacy groups, I guess because it puts a human face on an important issue that really affects everyone. And we have a United Nations screening coming up in May. UNESCO invited us to Cairo in November, and we presented the film in front of hundreds of ministers of education, and there have been screenings on Capitol Hill. But I think for me, what's been most surprising and rewarding is how many teachers have found the film on their own. We do have a tiny educational budget at Wide Angle, and every year we put some of our films into educational distribution. But this film is part of next year's package, so it hasn't gone out yet to the schools that it will go out to. But teachers have found it on their own, seen it, gone to the website, found a video copy, TiVoed it, and we're getting calls and emails from particularly, I would say, middle school teachers saying, my kids can't stop talking about the children in this film. We're doing projects. We're doing posters. I got one email from a teacher, and I read it through. I was practically in tears. She was saying, I've had meetings with the head of the school. My kids want to talk want to start writing to these children. They want to raise money. And, I've developed a whole curriculum around this. And then I read her name at the bottom, and I realized it was my son's ethics teacher. And she had found it on the web. And, I called her up, Elizabeth, let's talk about this, figure out how we can make something happen. I got an email at about 1 o'clock on a Tuesday from a teacher saying, my 4th grade is watching the film right now, and they have to know, did Raluca pass the exam? So I wrote back, yes, she did. And I got one right back from her saying, they're cheering. So that was, I think, really an extraordinary response. Maybe it's because these kids are the same age as the kids in the film. But, it gives me hope that that films like this that kids can relate to can help kind of create the global citizens that we need to become, and can create those bridges. There's actually a 5th grade in Lawrence, New York. It's not a particularly wealthy community at all, and a lot of the kids are from immigrant backgrounds themselves. And they started taking their lunch periods to talk about what they could do to help. And after they sent us about 3 emails, we said, okay, fine. And we put them in touch with the principal of Job's school. And after going back and forth a little bit, they decided that what Job's school really needs is a library. There's so many things you can't say in a film, even when it is 90 dreaded minutes long, and thank you all for sitting through it. One of them is that there aren't enough books there for the kids to take them home. And the reason that he goes before school is that's the only time he can sit there with that book and read it. So his school needs a library. So this school in Lawrence said, well, how much is it going to cost you? And it's working out between the construction and the books to be fairly expensive. It's over $10,000. So the kids said, okay, we can't do it in 1 year, and it's not a deep pockets community. We're going to do it in 2 years. And they're doing things like they're collecting used cell phones at holiday time when people tend to buy new things like that. They're sending them to agencies that then pay you $10 per cell phone. And, they're doing this. And so I think it is extraordinary and moving. And I hope you'll all go to the website to learn more, www.pbs.org/wideangle. And, just open it up to questions.
What success these research and studies in health and nutrition have had in being introduced into the third world educational systems?
Should we answer straight away? They've had quite a big success, actually. The coverage in Africa is quite impressive now. I'm not sure the exact figure, but it passed 25 sub-Saharan African countries where this has been mainstreamed throughout the country, and they're expanding to Asia, and I think they've been present in Latin America for a while. So this is a big push, and it's having a lot of success.
I was curious to know, following up on your comment that it's only 90 minutes. Could you say a little something about the cultural implications, particularly for some of the kids who are in more agricultural settings? How really are their lives different in both an economic sense and in a cultural sense from other children who don't have the opportunity for schooling?
Well, kids if I understand your question correctly, kids in the rural settings tend to be the most disadvantaged in terms of being able to get to schools. Among other things, there's a real concern that if girls, walk an hour to school, something bad could happen, and often does happen. And so that's, one of the big issues here for Raluca. It's, it's a fairly long walk, but there's lots of other kids with her. It's not that rural a city. It's a suburb of Kabul. But in a village like Nanavi is in, she actually had to move to her grandmother's village to be able to go to that school because there wasn't even a school out in the country where they were doing their subsistence farming. So those are some of the choices is, how many kids to focus on in a city, how many in a rural setting. And we tried to strike that balance because, as you point out, there are really striking differences in access. In Romania, as a matter of fact, there are a lot of educational access problems in Romania, but because we profiled the capital, then that wasn't an issue, But out in the country, and in terms of kids, Roma children, many just aren't even in school at all. So.
Can I just follow up? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I was thinking more about was the idea that, in some of the settings, it's fairly clear. So the one child in Afghanistan already had an older sister who was headed on a career path. There was sort of clear opportunities for her based on some sort of model, and obviously her sister had some opportunity. But for families that are in other kinds of situations, often sending your child to school means, and this is something that's true in the U.S. as well, suffering potentially some sort of long-term separation from there. There may not be any opportunity locally. It may mean that you're setting up your child to be away from the family for the rest of their lives. So I'm just trying to kind of sort out in my head what some of these cultural choices are that the families might be faced with. So a child who is a contemporary of either the child in Africa or the child in India,
how in 10 years do you see those girls' lives maybe being different? Do you see what I'm saying? Like
The girls that
what
we profiled?
Yeah, well, are the girls being profiled who have access to education as opposed to those girls who do not? Similar girls like them.
Sure. Well, I mean, clearly, in the case of Neeraj in India, it isn't. I mean, I think the reality for Neeraj is probably that unless she can make a jump from that night school into some kind of, as you point out, it would probably be, I forget what they call it, but I think they're charter schools where you actually sleep there in the dormitory and then maybe you come home on weekends because there isn't right there in the country where she lives. Unless she made that leap, and she'd need the support of her family to do it, I don't know that she would be able to become a teacher because as far as I can see, the math that she's doing now is easier than the math she was doing 3 years ago. And of course, she herself knows she slipped, even though her motivation is as strong as ever. On the other hand, by the fact that she's part of the film, her family, is kind of paying. She's special. They're seeing that she's special, and people are paying attention to her. So one never knows what's going to happen there. But she would really have to. I don't believe, if I'm correct, I don't think the Indian government is any longer supporting the night schools. I think they've decided not to support them because they just over time have felt that, well, it was a good grassroots thing when it started, but if you really look over time, it's not preparing these kids to really mainstream into the state schools. Now, Afghanistan, if she sticks with it, she will be better prepared to take a job. Like the ideal would be working for the government, like a civil service job, in Afghanistan. That would be, fantastic. But she's also got to face those cultural pressures because her father really does come under a lot of criticism for supporting his kids going to school. And as she gets older and she hits those teenage years and she's making that walk to school, if there isn't one closer, modesty is a big issue. There aren't enough female teachers. I don't know whether it came through. We tried to play it very, very carefully the way we played that scene. Her teacher wasn't in school that day, but the school didn't want to admit that. And so another teacher was brought in who really wasn't teaching the lesson. And why? Because there aren't enough female teachers in Afghanistan and to meet the demand. So if that doesn't start catching up, how much is she going to learn? Is she going to stay in school? Is she going to get bored? Even her, and then think about all the kids that aren't in school because the parents say, well, if there isn't a female teacher, if the school isn't in my backyard, or whatever the reasons are.
Yeah,
Is that helpful?
David Bloom, you mentioned that it will take about between $6 to $35 billion to achieve universal access to primary education. Now, I was wondering who you think can pay for it, because although it's not a big amount of money for the U.S. government, it's really unlikely that it's going to happen. And if you look at the foundations that perhaps may encourage educational initiatives, foundations oftentimes are looking for initiatives that are innovative in themselves. They're looking for initiatives that can fund themselves, so they're not looking to fund programs that cannot be self-sustaining, and local government obviously are not capable of raising that amount of money. So how do you think we can find that?
Good question. Ultimately, I think it will pay for itself. It'll pay for itself in the higher productivity and the earnings that people who have education will have. So in a sense, the real issue is how to get the money up front now to build the schools and get kids in schools so that the economies can grow. You get a bigger pie that can then pay back. So Gordon Brown, who's probably going to be Tony Blair's replacement, has had a very, very interesting idea. I think it's really the most interesting idea in the whole field of development finance. It's called the International Finance Facility, and it basically works like this. You have a country like, some of the European countries or the U.S., Canada. Every year they give a certain amount of money for international aid. And every year they decide how much it's going to be, and it goes up a little, it goes down, et cetera. But it's a decision that's made on a year. It's a commitment that's made on a yearly basis. What he said is the following: look, every year you make this commitment, and it never goes below X amount. Okay, why don't you just guarantee that minimum amount that you're going to commit for 15 years? And if you guarantee that to developing countries, then they can take that commitment to a commercial bank and say, look, I have a promise from Spain, Italy, France, United Kingdom, U.S., and Canada that they're going to give me financial aid or assistance of overseas development assistance of, let's say, $1 billion per year for the next 15 years. So I can pay back, guaranteed with that commitment, I can pay back a loan that maybe is much greater than 15 times that, okay, because I'm guaranteed $1 billion a year. So that can be the interest that I pay off every year on the initial thing. So loan me this big balloon payment of, $15 or $20 billion up front, and I can use that to build schools and train teachers. And another issue that comes up in schools is the infrastructure. A lot of the reason it seems why so many girls drop out, because the male-female difference isn't so much at the primary level, it's much more at the secondary level. And it seems to be at the age at which girls start having their periods. And it seems to be connected to the absence of adequate latrines at the schools. That's a big problem. So it's kind of another sort of public health issue in a way in the education system. Anyway, you can take this money up front, okay, and you can have sort of a big push on developing education. You get a lot of kids into school, you grow your economy, and then you can pay back subsequently. So ultimately, I don't think it's so much a matter of sort of international like charity and philanthropy. I think it's really a matter of solving a market problem, basically, essentially finding a way to make a loan to the country so that they can make these upfront investments. Because I think that these investments will pay back. Now, Gordon Brown's idea, this international finance facility, it's in place now, and they're experimenting. They're not experimenting with education. I think that would have been a very strong candidate. What they've decided to do is to experiment with what Matthew was talking about, which is immunization, vaccination programs, which is another one of these great investments that's, in the whole field of public health, it's hard to think of something that's more of a no-brainer because it's really, really cheap, and we absolutely know that it works. And part of it is just, kids grow up, stronger, they grow up healthier, their cognitive development is better, they stay in school longer. There are all sorts of benefits, economic benefits that follow on. So that was chosen for the pilot, essentially. And I think there are 5 or 6 countries that have committed a great deal of money now to this pilot. The Gates Foundation has also added in additional resources. And my guess is that when Gordon Brown succeeds Tony Blair, we're going to see, this is an idea that you're going to just read about and hear a great deal about. So I think that, to me, that's the most promising way forward regarding money. Because it certainly is a lot of money. The other thing with regard to money is the rich countries in the world have all made this commitment to give 0.7% of their national income to foreign assistance. But only, 2 or 3 countries in the world have actually come even close to do, I think Norway and maybe Denmark. I think if countries start actually trying to come closer to this commitment they've made, the U.S. is even committed, but the U.S. is probably down around 0.15 or 0.2% of its national income to foreign aid. I think that's also a tremendous source of additional resources, a lot of which will likely go to, I think, probably health and education, social development, it looks like, is where those resources are headed.
Yes, but there's an assumption in what you're saying that the government will actually be capable of providing the quality education that is needed to provide the financial returns or the economic development needed. So in your opinion, it seems that the money would go to the government and the government would be providing this universal quality access. So I guess my question is, if assuming that this is a wrong assumption, that the government is not going to be able to do it, and then we need partnerships with NGOs and corporations. Do you would it be possible to split this pie with, and how do you feel that we could access it? Do you think that government can do it alone?
I think the first step is to get butts into seats, as Len Pritchett so delicately puts it. And the one thing that I think all of the studies of sort of enrollment have shown is that people respond to incentives. Okay, so if you make if you make it easier, for kids to get to school, if you provide school lunches, if you provide uniforms, if you provide the books, if you build roads so that people can get more easily to the schools, if you put latrines into the schools, that makes it easier, more comfortable, for the girls to go to school, etc. People respond to that. Enrollment rates definitely do respond and go up. The next step is you want to keep the kids in school So you don't have this, sharp drop-off as you go from primary to secondary school. And the third step is really to, worry about what they're learning in school, the quality issue, which is extremely important, I think also. But, I think all of this is very, very amenable to resources. And that's what's been in short supply. I think political will, but, even more importantly, just the financial will and the financial backing. And I feel like that's what we're beginning to see some significant movement on now. So that's why I say we need to figure out what to do with those resources, because there are many, many different options, right? Matthew talked about, a bunch of different options. If we took half an hour, we could probably come up with 50 different options for how to spend those resources. What we don't know is really how to order those options. Where do we start? What options are complementary with each other? What goes better together? It's a problem of setting our priorities and to matching those priorities to the local realities. So I think that's really the challenge. But that's the kind of challenge that a graduate school of education, a program in international education. I think that's the kind of thing that you should be all, I think, thinking about, in cooperation with others, obviously.
My question is both for Professor Bloom and Ms. Hogan. What's in the reality, what is the impact of this kind of video in terms of raising awareness in producing resources? And it's very related to the question that you were addressing just before. Is something like this actually making governments make decisions? Because if it is, then it's something that should happen in a larger scale. So to what degree is a video seen by ministers of education and by the international financial institutions producing a really impact in producing more resources?
Yeah, so can I
you start.
try? So Pam mentioned that the video was shown at the General Assembly of UNESCO, their meeting?
Yeah, it was their yearly Education for All meeting where the ministers of education come.
Right. So that's absolutely the right first place to show it. You have the right audience. You have them talking together. They share some common experience, some common language, and understanding. I think, it needs to be shown at also, obviously different levels of government. It needs to be shown at, places like, the World Economic Forum meetings in Davos, at venues like this, et cetera. I think it reaches a larger audience. I don't know, it must be a year ago or something like that. I got this kind of, for me, very unusual phone call because I was asked to show up at the theater in Newton where they were showing this film. And after the film was over, I was asked to stand up and comment on it. I'm not used to that. I'm used to, this kind of a room, this kind of audience. Not, people who paid for, $7.50 a ticket and, to listen to me afterwards. But it was nice. It was very nice. People were very, very interested. The room, it was packed. And people asked very, very good questions. So I think the dissemination is important. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the website. I think that it's a phenomenal website. It's got just layer upon layer of resources. You must track the hits on this.
Yeah. No, the hits are tremendous. How that relates to policy change. I mean, we haven't seen U.S. giving go up yet. Like it didn't bump up the day after this aired on PBS. And obviously that's, eventually the home run. I mean, the UK, Gordon Brown has pledged $15 billion over the next 10 years. That's a really historic pledge. That's following through on Britain's promise. But nonetheless, that's the only leading country that's done such a thing. I think America's giving something like, well, our economy is 6 times larger than England's economy, and we're giving a third of that. So we have not followed through on that pledge. So all we can do is try and be part of that process. And, the Basic Education Coalition, their goal one year was to get Time for School into the hands of every single congressperson on Capitol Hill, and they did a pretty good job. And so, just to keep getting it out there. And we do find that one screening leads to another. We had a screening of the World Affairs Council in California, and that led to more screenings and articles in the San Francisco Chronicle. We had a screening in front of 9,000 educators at the National Education Association, and now we're getting requests from educators all over the world. But again, the next step to dollars, we haven't seen that yet.
Hi, I'm from Brazil, and I'm very happy to see my country in this fantastic movie. And I just want to know, how did you choose those children?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, first of all, talking with David and a number of our other sort of ad hoc consultants, we, having done a lot of research, we knew that we wanted to go to some countries which were experiencing the worst problems in terms of getting kids in school and keeping them there. And so that's what brought us to South Asia and to Africa. And then, we did read that Brazil is one of those countries that had done something really innovative and interesting. They're not the only one, but that their Bolsa Escola program of paying families a small amount per month had really been successful in getting, I think they went from somewhere in the 70 percentile to almost in the high 90s. Over a period of, more than a decade with Bolsa Escola in place, so much so that other countries, have followed suit and done similar programs to Bolsa Escola. And I think they've even tied it to things like inoculations and so forth. So really tried to make it a package of things that are good for kids and the long-term economic development of the family. So we thought, well, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have a positive story for once, so people don't just jump out of the window. And then, of course, having gone there, it's ended up being one of the most harrowing stories because, of course, Bolsa Escola is a great thing, and somebody like Jefferson might not be in school otherwise, and he's so bright, and you can see that he's getting this chance and rising to the top of his class. Who knew? Because when he first went to school, he was like all of our shots were of him squirming underneath the desk. He hadn't even figured out you're supposed to sit up in the chair. We didn't have high hopes, but he's really, really risen, and his intelligence and motivation are really coming out. But his favela has deteriorated in the 3 years since we've been filming there. It was, high crime rate to start. And the filmmaker, Alex Lima, used to joke. He'd say, oh, Pamela almost got me, killed in the favela. He lives in Rio. But then, it wasn't a joke when we went back this year. And literally, we would call to say, we're filming our other stories. When can you go? Listen, I've been going over there. There's no filming. You can't. Drug lords are coming out of jail. It's they're fighting with each other, the police every day. It's too dangerous. And then finally he said, okay, I'm going to go in. I'm going to make another approach. I think things have calmed down a little. And then he was asked for $20,000 bribe from the gangs. I mean, that's practically our budget, And so, really began to seem as though we weren't going to see Jefferson this year. We just didn't think it was going to be possible. And then ultimately, he said, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep going back because he befriended the family and he wanted Jefferson to be part of it. And eventually he made his way back in, and he describes it on the website. He says, first I talked to the head of the community association, then I talked to the head of the high school, then I talked to, this, that, and the other, and they finally led me to this guy surrounded by bodyguards with AK-47s. And they said, you can talk to him now. And I told him what I was doing, and he listened to me, and he said, if it's for the kids, we're with you. You can do anything you want. But but that's just heartbreaking because that reality of what Jefferson faces every day, if anything, I think we underplayed it in the film. You just wonder. Does that answer the question? Okay. Where are you from? From Sao Paulo.
Okay. Hi. This question is for whoever would like to field it. I'm wondering what, if anything, can be extracted or learned from what, through the research, through the filming, what is known about education around the world for those who are interested in the state of public education here in this country. What can be learned?
The question is, so is your question, what can be learned from this film that would be relevant for this country? What are the lessons of international education that would be relevant to this place?
Yes, from the film, from your research, from what you know. Just as an educator in this country, that's my concern.
There are so many things that I think are very positive about this production. One of them is having the purpose to educate ordinary citizens about some of the most important challenges of our time. Matthew put it very well. These are the future citizens of the world. Our future in our senior years is going to depend to a great extent to what happened to these kids. And so I think it is extraordinary that you have taken, Pamela, on the task of educating ordinary citizens about this reality. One of the things that is striking to me is to hear Pamela talk about the excitement of children and families in communities, because it suggests to me that this kind of film is filling a real void, a real need. So that is great for the film. It is a sign of deep concern about the fact that so little was known previously about these kinds of issues in schools. So, when you think back to the question of how are we going to pay for that, I think in some way these questions speak to the fundamental disconnect that exists between people who live in affluent countries and their neighbors, most of the world's youth who live in less affluent societies. And unless we find a way to bridge that disconnect, we are not going to have world peace. It's pretty clear to me. So I think it is very telling that communities are indicating to you, we're not learning this stuff in school. It's wonderful that you've produced this thing because it isn't everywhere. We're not seeing it ordinarily in television or in other channels. But there may be other lessons that come from this kind of research that are relevant for the U.S.
A lot of children say they realize how lucky they are. Mm-hmm. And that they've learned a lot by seeing that kids in other countries feel lucky to get into a school instead of burdened by it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And just to add, what I found very striking, just looking across the sort of the different kids in these situations, was the importance of the teachers. That when you have sort of well-trained but really committed teachers who really, really care, the difference that makes, and also the support from families. When there's family support, whether it's an older sister who's a role model or a father who's educated or whatever, that kind of support makes a huge difference. And I think that's true the world over.
I guess another lesson is this film is building, I think, on a tradition, Michael Apted series that followed, what was it, also 7 Children in England for a long time, but it was just in one society, exploring the same kind of twin influences of social class and social circumstances and schooling. The beauty of this film is that it expands the range of variation, both for socioeconomic circumstances and school conditions. And I think it shows just how powerful schools can be, which is, sometimes you may hear in these 90% of the research that Matthew was referring to, some debate on cynicism as to whether schools matter. Now, it's the kind of question that only individuals who can take an education system for granted can ask, but it's a silly question because the only way to answer it is to give up your education system and see what life would be like if you did not go to school or if you did not have the opportunity to go to school. So in some ways, for those of us interested in the question of how can schools shape the life chances of individuals, a film like this that shows a huge range of variation makes that a lot more clear than research that compares what are really, by world standards, very minor degrees of differences within a society. You may have thoughts on what are the lessons of a film like that for the U.S. or for domestic education.
Well, I'm not sure this is directly addressing your question, but sums up, I think, many things that we've already heard, which is that for all the great work that individual organisations and charitable organisations are doing, I believe that it's the actions of governments that are really going to make a difference in the world. And, of course, governments only act when, or for the most part, when their citizens care about the things that they're acting upon. And what better way to promote a sense of caring about these issues than watching a movie like this?
So I have a question for Pam, actually. So suppose someone came along and said, I love your movie, and here's X $million. I'd really like you to do another film, different countries. What would you do it, and what countries would you take, and how would it be different?
Different countries, but on the same subject of global education.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, it'd be so fascinating to go to Cuba, for example, which has done so much on a very small budget, just in a really amazing way of getting education out to rural kids, and involving field work with schoolwork, and really, I think, could be a model for other countries. I would love to go to the Middle East. We in fact, we had a child in a Palestinian refugee camp who we wanted to film with, and we had to decide between him and Afghanistan. And it was, and the reason we had to decide was just budgetary issues. I mean, we had a very limited budget, and I still think about him and wonder how he's doing, and wish that he were in the film, because that's going to be part of the world, obviously, going through so many changes, and refugee situations are displacing kids all over the world and creating, disconnects in whole generations of children in terms of their ability to just get a basic education. So, and then after that, I would ask you. I'd call you and I'd say, David, where else should we go? We've got $1 million more. Tell us.
Is that what it would
and what would you say?
Is that what it would take, $1 million?
No. I mean, this film was made for, I don't know, $400,000 each time we've gone. We spent about $400,000. Now, from my Bill Moyers days, I know that he will not spend $1 on production until he has one matching dollar for outreach, publicity, and so forth. But I don't live in that world now, and so we spend $400,000 that goes on the screen, and we don't have any money for outreach or publicity or advertising or anything. So it would take $400,000 to do another 7 children.
But this is tiny. This is the dust on the rounding error on the amounts we were talking about before.
Yeah, it's not a lot of money.
Now you didn't mention the U.S., for example.
Yeah.
Where is the U.S. in all
Where's
this?
the U.S. story? We researched a lot of stories, in the U.S. We were trying to decide, should we go to an urban setting or should we Appalachia? And then ultimately, first of all, there's so little global programming on television, and Wide Angle was really PBS's, answer to let's fill in a gap, a niche that the commercial networks are not doing. That's what PBS is for. And so it's hard for us to take, our precious hour every week for our 12 little slots and say, we're going to devote 15 minutes of one of these hours to an American story. That's not why Wide Angle was created. I think also it could have created, I think our audiences would have come to it then with a different perspective. They'd be comparing, well, you chose a child in Jersey, but I'm living in Missouri. I think in a way we've leveled the playing field by saying all of these children come from somewhere else, but look at the universality between their experience and your children's.
So we're going to take one more question, and then we need to close.
Thank you very much for a very interesting film. I just have one question. At the end of this 12-year project, are you planning to have a big meeting with these 7 children, or what's your plan at the end? I think having some kind of meeting or event will make a bigger impact.
We're making it up as we go along. I hope so. I can't imagine going through this project and not having all the children meet each other in the same room and all of us meet all of them. In fact, there even have been considerations, of flying one of the children or 2 of the children in to a PBS event. So far, we just, again, feel they're too young. It would be too disruptive in the lives that they're leading and put too much pressure on them. And also most, don't speak English, but it's just, not wanting to put that pressure. I certainly would hope that we would all have a chance to meet. I have a feeling that the kids are going to lead the way with this as they get older. They already feel like they're a part of something, and they're voicing how they feel about it and what they want to do. And if they tell us they want to have a meeting, we'll have a meeting. The question will be, where do we have it?
Well, thank you very much, Pamela and David and Matthew, for spending your afternoon with us, and to all of you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.